First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I wish we were all together in person. Um, while Zoom has become somewhat efficient, you can kind of bounce from Zoom to Zoom. I don't find it terribly personal. I don't find it um, candidly that effective in kind of judging a crowd, particularly in a setup like this. And so I do hope we all get together soon enough. I'm going to assume that the way we'll handle this is to make it more of a discussion. And so I'll respond to the first question. I hope Yoel will, and I hope we'll have some discussion thereafter. As I understand the first question, it's how's the current crisis affecting day-to-day work, and where will we be in 6 months? It's a little bit like the Zoom, which is I can work. It's even efficient, and sometimes I'm not sitting in traffic. But I think a lot of the creativity that comes out of meeting together and brainstorming gets lost. And I think part of being a venture capitalist is, or maybe perhaps the two most important things. One is networking, which is harder and harder to do with the physical distancing. Parenthetically, I don't love the term social distancing. I prefer the term physical distancing. And second of all, I think it affects the ability to kind of brainstorm and kind of hack things out creatively. In fact, today, after 4 or 5 weeks, maybe more, of not meeting in person as a partnership, we met in an open field as a group because we had some things we wanted to sort out and brainstorm, and it was just too hard to do it on Zoom. And so it's affected, obviously, our day-to-day interactions as a firm. Clearly, it affects companies who need to preserve cash for an uncertain period, which is quite a segue to the second question. I have no idea where we'll be in 6 months. I think more than anything, this is not a risk-driven crisis, but an uncertainty-driven crisis. And I'm as uncertain as the next guy and don't feel like I have a crystal ball. And I think the way you react to uncertainty is different than the way you manage risk. And so we, for a while, have thought that there was stock market had been on a run for a while, and venture capital and startups, even though they shouldn't be, are very correlated to stock market performance. Our LPs, our limited partners who invest with us, think we've been a little crazy. We've written in our last bunch of annual letters that we're paranoid, so we keep stocking up on cash at our companies, and well, eventually it came. And so even a broken clock is right twice a day. And so our companies, have been preserving cash for longer periods of time, call it 18 to 24 months. We have one company in the travel industry whose revenue has gone to almost zero. I keep joking, we have like $8,000 or $9,000 a day of revenue at that company. There still must be some Israeli backpackers somewhere in the world using this service. But other than that, most of the companies have just really, really focused on the core of the business and extended cash runway by 24 months. And who knows if this is 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, if it's up and down and sideways for the next 24, 36, or 48 months, I have no idea. I'll turn it over to Yoel.
Oh, good. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate. I really enjoyed the last time I've been lecturing to you. I think it was almost a year and a half ago. And this was under it was not a capacity then, but it was, under the heritage of the chief economist.
Yoel, can you please speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Yes. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. The last time I spoke was about a year and a half ago on a seminar, and this was the capacity of the chief economist of the ministry, and we talked about the Israeli economy. And I think that one of the things I said about the way the government actually dealt with the economy, the Israeli economy at that time, that we don't have enough buffers for a rainy day, meaning running a very high, relatively high deficit at that time compared with the fact that the Israeli economy was performing very well. And I think I said at that time that, there's going to be a crisis sometime, but we never envisage a crisis like this. And I think this is a very high magnitude crisis across the world, which will affect the economy for a long period of time. But now, as a manager in a fintech company, a global fintech company, the first issue I have to take care of is our own business. So we are in the business of cross-border payments mainly, and we cater for different verticals, but the main vertical is e-commerce, and we cater for sellers of e-commerce on platforms like Amazon and Walmart in the US, and some of them are domestic, but most of them are cross-border, meaning basically Chinese and other e-commerce sellers. And to some surprise, this business has been quite resilient in the past several months. So we understand that this is a huge economic shock that will affect consumption across the board, probably in the US and in other developed economies. But on the other hand, at least for now, and I think maybe later on as well, because of the closure and because of the fact that brick and mortar stores are basically closed all over the Western world, we see a huge bias towards e-commerce. So e-commerce is actually thriving. Both if you look at the figures of Amazon, Walmart, and other e-commerce platforms in the US, you see large or very fast growth. It was an evolving kind of a crisis where it started on the supply side in China, and we are managing, I manage also people in China, and I actually left China on the middle of January for the last time, where it was a minute that something is happening, but it was not so clear to what extent. But as it started from there, and our main concern was whether our Chinese customers who are suppliers for e-commerce platforms in developing countries will survive and will be able to produce and ship their goods to their target markets. Now it's a different issue altogether, and we move from a supply side shock to a demand side shock, which is evolving. So in that sense, I think looking forward, it's going to be, you know, it'll take time, but I think that the second half of this year, hopefully, if we do manage to somehow go over this wave and not get a second wave of continuation, we'll see some revival in economic activity, and of course in commerce and in other economic activities. So from the e-commerce business, our business has been quite resilient. We also cater for travel, which was totally almost entirely stopped. Payoneer pays for on behalf of Airbnb to most of its hosts around the world, and of course all those revenues streams have stopped. And we also cater for freelancers, where there I think the impact is not clear yet. So we'll probably see a reduction in the demand for freelance and gig economy services on, let's say, in developing countries by large corporations or corporations in the developed world, where capex is going to investment are going to go down as a direct outcome of the reduction in demand, but also the huge uncertainty that engulfs us looking forward into the economic future. On the personal side, I mean, we've been working from home for the past 6 weeks. I've been quite surprised to the fact that we actually manage to continue working as a team, and the team is global. So the majority of the people are here in Israel, but we have people in China and also people in the US. So we are a bit used to the fact that we need to use, you know, Zoom and other Teams and other applicants like that to our daily work. But we managed to continue and actually close deals and move forward and introduce new products and services and doing relatively well. And this was, to me, as a personal experience, quite surprising.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question, which was, how do you assess the government handling the crisis so far? Of course, considering the huge prices that the economy had to pay. So I'll start with Michael. One moment.
I think we should start Yoel. Let Yoel go first this time.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so it's hard to judge before this thing is over, but it seems that the reaction of the government of Israel has been very strong. In the sense that the main purpose was initially to defend or to shelter the public health system. It is as strong as that now, if you look on TV, you see commercials of hospitals actually crying out, saying they are losing a lot of money because people don't come and get their normal treatment. So, the same system that was defended by these harsh news as actually suffers quite a lot, like most of the economy. So, but on the other hand, it would be very hard to judge if it was overreacting. To a certain extent, I think it's from the political economy side of it, and when you are the decision maker, it's easier to get into these quarantines and take these tough measures once you actually face kind of a threat, which might be exaggerated, but nobody knew at that time. It's much harder to go out of it. So, I mean, take all those tough measures seems quite, you think that you save lives and stuff, and you do that. But getting out of that, it's quite more complicated. So I hope that, decision makers will have the strength to do that, because the economic damage is not as imminent as the number of people dying every day, right? So hopefully, I mean, fortunately in Israel we don't have so many people dying, but the fact that the economic damage caused by this paralysis is spreading relatively. It was quite fast, but the outcomes will be felt for long period. And, it is still hard for us to assess or to grasp the huge impact of this on the economy. I think that one of the things that we see is that even capital markets all over the world don't appreciate rightly what's happening. I mean, the fact that oil went to, WTI went negative last week is something that has never happened. So this actually resembles or actually shows the huge reduction in demand on the global economy. So I think that, I mean, we managed up till now to deal with the pandemic quite okay in Israel. But now the big task going forward is to try to revive the economy and revive the government's financial stance, which is going to be terrible. I mean, the deficit is going to reach about 11% this year, according to the Ministry of Finance estimates. Debt to GDP ratio will climb to around 75%, and I don't see any clear, at least at this time, clear exit strategy in this fiscal stance, which can't continue for a long time. So, Michael, please, if you want.
So I certainly agree with Yoel's first point in that it's very early to judge still. It's easy to jump to snap judgments. That's what newspapers get paid for. But I think reasonable people are required to wait. That having been said, I think the core question that I don't see anybody addressing is, what are we measuring? And what you measure is critical to how you judge the outcome. I think Yoel's point, which is that the Israeli government has been successful, I agree with, by the way, because they shut down early, and the principal thing being measured was how few people we admit into hospitals so we don't crush the health system. And by the way, for what it's worth, I think when you have something that is uncertain, rather than risky, which is, I think, the case here, the first thing you do is create buffers, which means shut it down. And since we didn't know what R0 was, what was the rate of spread of the virus, that was the appropriate response, and perhaps is the appropriate response. And my view of the health ministry, for what it's worth in this case, and Moshe Barsimanto, who runs the ministries, he did actually a very good job. And when you look at Israel relative to the rest of the world, if what we're measuring is a number of people who have unfortunately died, we've actually done a pretty good job. And I give the government high marks for that. The question becomes, what else are we measuring? And I think, in my view at least, the economic leadership of this country gets somewhere between a C- and a D, both in the way they anticipated what is going on here, not before it happened, but while it was going on, and some of their conclusions and the kind of blunt tools and statements that they've made. As a point of fact, the most pessimistic assumption they had was that 500,000 people would be unemployed. They couldn't restore payroll taxes to people to keep people employed fast enough or at all for now. And the Director General of the Ministry of Finance went before a Knesset committee to say he was pretty sure it was going to be over by the end of the year. I don't know where his prophecy is from. And when I look now at the 80 billion shekels being proposed, which is effectively, as Yoel said so well, mortgaging the future of our children and grandchildren, I don't see any effective policy tools or intervention tools to know what we're getting at. Like, what are we measuring here? How much money we can spend? How much money we can flush down the toilet? How much money we can spill on industry? I mean, what are we measuring? And my personal view is that this is due to a few things. One is few people making the decisions have worked in the private sector or managed businesses and understand what employment is. And a lot of the people in the finance ministry, many of whom are very, very bright, and a lot of people in the economic leadership of the economics ministry have not worked in the private sector and understand how employment unfolds and what happens. I laugh at this term called chalat, which is used here, which is chufsha lelo tashlum, a vacation or a furlough without getting paid. That's false. It's just a question of who's paying it. Is the employer paying it or the taxpayer paying it? And so I think that there was insufficient use of technology and tools to be able to assess real microeconomic information here. That's still the case. Israel has a digital lag at the government level where things are outdated and stuff that private companies are using to assess demand and economic health for some reason are not in the use of our government. I think there's been too much grandstanding and talking in bold numbers and bold spheres without concrete plans. And just about 2 hours ago, I got to see a spreadsheet of how the government plans to use its money. And even there's no goals. What are we measuring is not clear. And if you can't measure it, in my view, it doesn't exist. And so I'm worried. I'm like really worried. And I'd like to understand is our goal to restore employment? Is our goal to restore the resilience of households? Is our goal to increase economic growth? And I'd really like to know are we on short-term economics or long-term economics? Because I think that's really critical. To Yoel's point about mortgaging the future, someone's got to pay the bill eventually. This doesn't work forever. And just to wrap that up, I don't only blame the civil servants. I actually think these guys have done an unbelievable job over the last year. At a time where our politicians have behaved both inexplicably and irresponsibly, abandoning the governments of this country and forcing the finance ministry, people working around the clock like Shaul Meridor and Roni Chizkiyahu, to have to manage a country without a budget. And that's just irresponsible and not okay. And as citizenry, we shouldn't stand back and take that. And personally, I've taken initiative with a group of tens of people over the last 3 weeks to attempt to put some measurements behind this, and we'll release that on Thursday. Try to ask, what are we measuring? Because it's not clear to me that the political leadership has set those goals for the civil servant leadership to get behind. and it's disturbing.
And
Yeah, I
so
want to.
I think we moved on a bit to the weaknesses question. What weaknesses does all this bring to light? There was an example that Michael mentioned in passing. A lot of people have come out at the level of IT of the government, specifically the tax authority, that managing all of these payments that we're supposed to get to people quickly and calculating between the different authorities is really complicated. And because many workers, also in the public sector, are in Khalat, the processes that need to be happening are happening even slower in some cases.
I think that there are some different levels of weaknesses that we can look at. One is on the micro side, and I agree with Michael. I mean, the government always lacks high frequency data. I mean, we are not. I mean, we are collecting it in lag. Each data you get from the Central Bureau of Statistics is a lagging indicator. It's not a leading indicator, and it's very hard for the government to understand what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure that other governments have the same, have that ability to see what happens, like a business sees its daily cash flow and can manage it. But in that sense, I think that, early government response is very broad, is not very targeted, and it has some, objectives. I'm not sure that they were, articulated right, but the government should give some kind of, understanding that this is something that you cannot assess initially the length of time that it will take. You need to create some kind of a broad safety net, especially for households, especially for the ones that are, more weaker household. And to a certain extent, you do that by either giving unemployment benefits or trying to preserve employment. So, and I agree that the Khalat thing was not really very, let's say, this is not very efficient. It allowed large businesses which don't seem to have any really problem to lay off people or just to outsource part of their wage bill to the government in times which are, the government is scarce in resources. And this was the decision-making process I really a little bit know about was not very structural. It came from all kinds of different people, not only from the Ministry of Finance. It came all the way to the Prime Minister. Decisions were taken bluntly without any consideration. Even if things have to be quick, they could be done on a more professional way. And this is part of the process of who's running this on the economic side. And we have some, also political backgrounds and issues in that, because in order for the Ministry of Finance to run this in a coordinated way, they need the weight on the political level to support them and have all the support they need. And apparently, in the current political situation where we have a Ministry of Finance and runoff without a budget and without a proper, mechanism to implement economic policy, everybody's word is equal, and in the end, the decision maker in this sense, the Prime Minister, just decides, but probably not based always on very professional analysis, and this is a pity. But then the second stage is where you want to actually streamline it and target, once you understand where the problems are, try to target the government aid to certain sectors, to certain segments of the economy, and not to continue to do it on a very broad basis. And I think the main issues going forward is employment. Okay, so the effect on employment is very unequal. Like people with high skills, people that work in financial institutions, in services, in high tech, they can continue to work from home. If the company has a business case and the business is not gone, they'll be able to continue even if they are in quarantine. But all the manual jobs, all the on other people with less skills, they are not able to work from home. They find themselves out of work. And of course, there are certain sectors that have been, hit the most, like travel, tourism, which are heavy on or rich on labor, and this will affect unemployment. And I think this is the main issue going forward. So we need to create some kind of a safety net, which is for household, and then you have to create some, assuming that there is some recovery, even if it's slow, that will help companies to actually employ more people. And in that sense, small and medium businesses are the ones that actually hold the most of the employment. So it's not the large enterprises, right? So if you want to drive productivity, you should emphasize on large enterprises. Once you want to drive employment, you actually have to target the small and medium businesses, and they're gonna. A lot of them are not going to be there on the other side, and this is a huge problem. So looking forward, we probably need to continue investment or expenditure in the government, but it should be more targeted towards growth, towards employment, meaning, let's say, cutting the wage tax and other issues. But this also should be accompanied by many structural reforms that will actually make this economy more efficient on the other side. But here, I think we have a huge problem, because to enact structural reforms, you need a lot of political capital, and I'm not sure that we have it. If you take, for example, the last major downturn in Israeli economy, which actually happened in the beginning of the 2000s, the combination of the dot-com bubble and the second uprising created a really sharp downturn in the Israeli economy. We were on the verge of a financial crisis. But that time, the now Prime Minister and then Minister of Finance managed to actually leverage that crisis and create a lot of changes in the economy that actually we benefited from for many years to come. And this is, it happened, let's say 20 years ago. Hopefully it will not happen, such a huge crisis will not happen in the next 20 years. We should use this crisis, going out of this crisis, as a 1 in 20 years opportunity to enact a lot of structural reforms that will make this economy more competitive, more efficient, and will help us also in achieving our growth much faster than otherwise.
Okay.
I'm not sure that we have that, as I said, political capital in place to support kind of reforms.
All right, thank you. So we'll move on to the next question.
If I can,
Yes.
yeah, I actually would like to build on what Yoel said.
Yes.
And kind of borrow an analogy. Many of us have seen, off-road vehicles in Israel go off-road and end up in mud. And you see all these young guys get out of the car in the mud, and it's an older car, and they begin to try to push it out of the mud while, they're trying to put cardboard underneath, and they're looking under the car, and the wheels or the tires are low on air, and the brakes don't work exactly, and the fuel tank's sprung a leak, and the oil tank is leaking, and the exhaust pipe's falling off the backside of the car. And I think this Corona has given us the opportunity to peek under the car as it's stuck in the mud just before we get it out of there, and kind of start to think about what is the long-term hold, because Corona has been a bit like a time machine here for us. It's showed us, to Yoel's point, I think is correct, what happens to some unskilled labor when digitization and automation hits, and that's going to happen. Second is, this has accelerated the use of digital infrastructure. 85-year-old people are using BIT to transfer payments now. In the US, they're using Venmo. And so financial services, digitization is being accelerated. Zoom has become kind of the norm. And there's and not to mention deliveries and e-commerce and retail, which are all accelerating. And these are all parts of the economy that employ lots and lots of people. And we have this notion of a social safety net and unemployment. but it's not sufficient. And we cannot, as a social contract, just pay people unemployment. We cannot, as a society, then look them in the face and say, you were laid off because of Corona, because of structural changes in the economy, because of automation and digitization, and we're really sorry we didn't help you find new skills in this economy. I don't think that's morally or ethically okay. And I think the government, as I like to say, it's called the Unemployment Bureau for a reason. They changed the name quite quaintly to the Employment Bureau, but they did nothing about it. They just simply send you out. But you don't come out with any more skills. And as Yoel correctly said, if there's been a watershed moment here where people who are higher skilled are kind of left employed, even remotely for the most part, and lower skilled people are left unemployed, that's not okay. And it should cause us to re-examine what our training and teaching infrastructure looks like in order to help people gain skills as they go through life. And then in order, to Yoel's point also about medium-sized employers, to help those employers and the potential employees find a match by upskilling, by digitization, by a million ways, so we can get people back to work in high productivity ways. And I think one of the things we need to take out of this is an absolute commitment of private industry and the public sector to work together around upskilling people. I think it's morally reprehensible that we don't let ourselves get to the point where people look around and can't figure out what skill they have to compete in the modern economy. And that starts with the teachers union and the education system. It starts with the Unemployment Bureau, and it starts with the government and private sector's responsibility to our fellow citizens, to our brothers and sisters, to go do this. And I don't see anyone spending enough time on that. And if you want to know what investing in infrastructure is, the first thing it is, it's investing in human beings. And I think to kind of build the long-term functioning of our economy, we must invest in human beings, and we must make other infrastructure investments, because if this is going to be an 80 billion shekel or 90 billion shekel investment plan and not just a spending plan where we spend a lot up front and then fine-tune it, we got to have an investment thesis that is measured in what is the future productivity of that human infrastructure investment, the human capital investment, and a physical and digital infrastructure investment.
Okay, so we'll move on to two more questions, and please notice the time because we want to take some questions from the audience. So the two last questions were, what are the steps that we take specifically towards the high-tech sector? And the last question was, how do we see the recovery playing out? So we already somewhat addressed the fifth question, but I think we still didn't talk so much about the role of government in keeping the market flexible and able to react quickly to the situation. For example, in terms of regulations or other things which may be in the way. So Yoel, you can.
If you want to relate to high tech, I think that you have to understand what is the actual aim of the government intervening in any market, and especially in the high tech market. So. So the thing is that the government should intervene in markets if there are externalities, and for R&D, especially in the early stages, there is large externalities, positive externalities. So I mean, there is an interest of the government to support early stage R&D because from the entrepreneur point of view, he might lose everything, but even if he loses, the state still gains from this experiment and from the R&D done, and it could be utilized somewhere else. So this is the rationale for supporting R&D. But it's more relevant, especially in times like that, in times of crisis, where we might find ourselves where venture capital flows will dry up to a certain extent. And this country has been enjoying a huge influx of investments in R&D cross-border mainly. In the past years, I think in 2019, the flow was more than $6 billion, if I remember right. And this actually fuels a lot of the activity in the this market and in the Israeli economy. And there is a chance that, you know, at least in the next couple of years, the amount of money flowing in will be much lower, and probably it will hurt, first of all, you know, early stage kind of startups and investment in R&D, and there is where the government should intervene. In that sense, I think that when those large flows were coming in, the government should have stepped back from intervening in the market, because in that sense, what we saw is that there is excess demand for skilled labor in Israel, and as the supply is limited, what we saw is only the more the government intervenes or the more the flows coming in, that is the price of skilled labor went up quite dramatically. So in that sense, some more sanity is not too bad for the sector. But then again, in these times, the government is the time for the government to try and intervene and invest in early stage R&D. That's for that sense. As I said, I mean, you said the right things about regulation and stuff. I think this also relates to the fact that this is normally an opportunity to do a lot of changes in the economy, and not only changes that relates to government expenditure, but relates to the way business is being done and business is being regulated. And I think there's a lot of place for deregulation and all kinds of other structural reforms that will create better fundamentals for economic activity in Israel going forward. And we shouldn't miss this opportunity. I think it's a huge opportunity. Of course, the government will have a lot of issues on its mind and a lot of things to deal with, but I'm almost sure that at least in the Ministry of Finance, looking forward for the new government, there is a plan being built to address a lot of inefficiencies and distortions in the Israeli economy, and use this crisis as an opportunity to push those issues forward. We didn't manage to do that in recent years because it's much harder, at least in Israel. We are world champions in pro-cyclical policy, and it's very hard to to reduce deficits and to push reforms when things are so good and the economy is growing fast. Apparently, it's normally, at least in the past, it was much easier to do very drastic things during downturns and when everything is so bad. So it's not the best thing to do, but I think this is something we need to again to use this moment and to create the right fundamentals to another at least 20 years of prosperous growth in the Israeli economy looking forward.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I know you want to get to questions, so I'll take it really quick. I totally agree with Yoel about the need to use this crisis to get rid of a pile of regulation. It's outrageous how long it takes to get approval to build anything and get government licenses, et cetera. But I think a lot of that talks to an important point, which is the need for the government to get at the forefront of its own digitization, which is, of course, resisted by the unions. There was even a statement by the head of the teachers union, or actually, I think it was the head of the General Histadrut union, saying, do your digitizations, but you're not getting rid of any of our employees. Well, it's hard to get productivity up if you just, invest in digitization and don't lower costs in any ways. It kind of defeats the purpose. And so that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is I've already been on record, Eugene Kandel, who I love and is a close friend, and I debated this quite publicly. I don't think the government should intervene in high tech at all. Yoel said that generally, the government should intervene in down markets and then kind of pull back in up markets. Unfortunately, they never do. Once the government starts spending on something and creates jobs and ministries and everything else, they just keep spending money. And so I'm completely against the government intervening in the high tech market. I don't think we have a market failure here at all. We have a classic market shakeout. And I'll just point out that after every economic crisis that has hit, from the dot-com crash to 2008, foreign investment in Israeli venture capital and R&D has gone up. And there's more money here now than there was in any of those periods before. And there are other parts of this economy, small and medium businesses, people in the tourism industry unemployed, that's 450,000 people. that need this money far more than the high-tech economy does, and I'm one of them. And I haven't heard anyone at the government propose, for example, if they give money to high-tech, that they'd wipe out the equity holders. Because at least in my view of capitalism, if you're left exposed when the tide goes out, you ought to be taken advantage of by the next money in. And I haven't heard that proposed. This feels like free beer, and I'm not a fan of free beer. I think things need to be paid for. And I think there's enough money in the venture capital industry, somewhere between $4 and $6 billion of free cash right now, and people are investing. And that's what the market's about. And, as Yoel said before, the high-skilled people are finding work. And we've got companies that are recruiting tens of people a week right now because they're growing, much like I think Yoel said Payoneer is right now because e-commerce has taken off. So we got a pile of companies in this economy are growing. And, the high-tech system doesn't need a bailout. To Yoel's point about investing in research, I actually agree. We ought to invest in research, not in startups. We got to kind of double down on fundamental basic research as a country. And that's, of course, been limited by the number of open positions at university, et cetera, but we don't have time to get into that. So we can turn it over to questions.
Okay, so we'll move on to questions. And I already wrote in the chat, but we'll take questions in two modes. People can either write down their questions and I'll read them out. Or if anybody wants to just come up and join the conversations, and I can put them on. The first question we have is from Ken. Ken, I think you're on. I think you can speak now. Ken, can you hear me? Okay, so I think, Ken? Okay, so I'll read out Ken's question because he seemed to be having an audio issue. So Ken asked two questions, actually. His first question was regarding Yoel's first comment that the stock market has not doesn't know what to do yet. So he asked if maybe it means the stock market didn't bottom out yet. And the second question of Ken was, has the Israeli government already loosened any regulations or restrictions on the medical industry as has been done in the US? If so, is it changes temporary or can it be made permanent after the crisis?
So you want me to take the first one?
Yes, of course, assuming you know the answer to the second question, which I'm not sure.
No, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, Ken, I'm sorry, the second question is not in the scope of this conversation.
So, it's a personal perspective. It's not something that I know and nobody knows, but it seems to me that I think if you read the IMF's forecast for the world economy, right, which was published, I think, on April 14th, the World Economic Outlook of the IMF, this is going to be a much, sharper decline than the one we saw in 2008. And looking at their forecast, at least, about the recovery, they say it's going to be a shallow recovery. So, taking that macro forecast, and now looking at the capital markets, you see that if you compare capital markets in 2008 to capital markets now, you see there is a huge difference. Having said that, I think that it takes time. So we saw a very sharp decrease in capital markets initially, then a rebound. If you look at 2008, it took months over months to get to the bottom in that sense. And this is a different crisis, right? There and then it was a financial crisis. It started from, as somebody said, it was a top-down crisis. Started from the financial system and then went all the way to the real economy. Here it starts in the real economy. It will probably grow to the financial system, apparently, because with so many companies and businesses going out of business or having huge problems, I mean, this will be reflected in balance sheets of banks, though they have some more buffer. So I think maybe this will take more time to grasp, but the economic damage is huge. And I don't know how you actually price shares at this environment. You can never know what is the future earnings. So what is price to earnings currently? The only thing that there is there, that supports basically those markets is the huge influx of money from both government and central banks. But in the end, I see it more as a technical issue and not a fundamental issue. So I believe that in the end, the market should actually uh, show what is happening in the real economy. Of course, they are looking forward, but the real economy is in really bad shape, and markets have not moved so much. And this is to my, personal judgment, but not more than that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next question will take us from Koren. I think he's actually in the United States now. Koren, do you want to go up and ask your question, or okay, I'll read it out. So Koren asks, why do you think government plans seem to be focused on giving handouts, grants, and loans as opposed to tax credits and reducing the tax burden on Israeli citizens?
Yoel probably better positioned to answer that than I would. I was in touch with many government officials 5, 6, 4 weeks ago, et cetera. They seem to be incapable of figuring out how to do these tax credits early on in this crisis. They could have kept them. 5, 6 weeks ago, I suggested to them that they should just cancel payroll taxes to make sure people stayed employed. They'd end up paying for it anyway on this chalat, on this vacation without getting paid or being transferring their payment to the taxpayer. And it seemed like they couldn't figure it out. I think it was a lot of shell shock. The fact that the poor civil servants in the finance ministry have been operating under unbelievable duress for over a year without a government. I think doing a yeoman's job of trying to stay sane as the politicians danced around election after election, and I just think it was hard to kind of jump into this, but I don't know. It's I don't know.
I think that initially tax burden will go down dramatically, and if you look at the government expenditure, this is the automatic stabilizers. The deficit will grow just because even if they haven't spent an extra shekel, because income is going to go down. I mean, the activity is so low, and that people will not pay VAT because they're not selling anything, and companies' profits are going to be decimated, so there won't be any there aren't going to be any corporate tax, and of course personal income. When people get unemployed, they don't pay income tax. So in that sense, tax burden will go down initially. Going out of this, it's a big issue. How do you finance this huge deficit? So, I mean, this is not sustainable, right? So, looking forward, not to the immediate future, the government have several, bad decisions or alternatives to choose from in order to reduce close to reduce debt to GDP ratio and reduce the deficit. Is either cut services, and especially after a kind of a crisis like this, people would like to see huge investment in the health system above what has been invested up to now. And on the other hand, so you can cut expenditure, or you raise taxes, or you hope for faster growth, which might happen and might not, and it might take time. So there are some issues, I think, and reducing, employment tax is something that has been found by the IMF as the most efficient driver of increasing employment at times where you are at a high employment environment. This is something that you need to do. You need to do other things. We've been increasing the cost of labor quite dramatically in recent years by increasing minimum wages quite dramatically. So it seems that it works forever, and if you look at the current, I think, proposed coalition agreement, the Labour Party actually wants to increase it even further. So, I mean, they're fighting yesterday's war. I mean, it seems, and if you listen to the Prime Minister's economic advisor, he says that there's no minimum wages does not affect employment. Well, it does not affect employment when you have a heated economy where there's, excess demand and the supply shortage in labor and everybody's employed. Once you want to get out of an unemployment situation, this is a huge barrier to increase employment because it takes a long time for a business to hire another person if he has to, has to pay him at least the minimum wages. On top of that, all the expenses and pension, obligatory pension, and labor tax. So all these things create a huge threshold, a high threshold for unemployment. So at least temporarily and at least to certain sectors, minimum wages should go down on the way out of this in order to increase employment much faster. So these are the issues that should be dealt. And as I said, I think that the major target for the government going forward from this is retaining or going back to growth and growing employment, because as we said before, this is not affecting everybody equally. It will increase dramatically the inequality, and it does affect low-skilled workers much more than high-skilled ones, and it will increase this issue. So the government should find all the ways, reforms, and the fiscal measures to support employment on the way out from this, and when we recover.
Thank you.
Ironically,
yes.
just to build on Yoel's point, ironically, I think the policies that the government has taken and the ones being proposed in the coalition agreement by, ironically, the Labor Party, are further widening income disparities in this country. Anytime you print this much money or spend this much money, you make it more worthwhile to have assets rather than money. And therefore, people already have assets effectively become better off. And people with less assets, which is a large percentage of the unemployed people, become worse off. And then you put up a barrier to employment by raising minimum wage. And if you don't find a commensurate way to get rid of that by either reducing taxes, reducing regulation, or reducing the social benefits, you further entrench this income disparity and unemployment. And I don't know. I never took any courses in economics, but it seems to be the ABCs to me.
Okay, thank you. So Corinne had a question that Corinne? 1 second, Corinne, you're muted. A moment. Corinne, you need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Corinne. Corinne?
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so what I wanted to ask is that, usually it is known that free economies and free societies are better for innovation. And I am wondering, in a society that we have suddenly awakened us to with coercive policies, with with much less freedom in our everyday life, in over-regulation of businesses, how is the innovation going to be hampered by it? How is it going to be restrained? And what we can do to try not to become, very dystopian society without innovation, and on the other hand, bring what we know what to do as Israeli, which is to deal with emergencies as individual from bottom up and not from top down.
Okay. So,
Yoel, do you want to address this first?
Well, yeah, I think that innovation is something that is quite abundant in this country, but it could be supported if you're right. I think the fact is that we need to create the right atmosphere for fostering innovation, and hopefully, I mean, we haven't seen it yet, and we don't see the whole picture yet, I think, and we don't see the total outcome of this. In certain senses, I think that we will see very fast innovation. I think that Israelis are always good at getting the opportunities right. I think this crisis actually creates a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of misery, but a lot of opportunities. And if you're agile enough and understand the fundamentals, you can find a way to innovate and to benefit from the situation. Because Israeli innovation is basically, and maybe that's at least, I mean, maybe it's to a certain extent, it's not a great thing, but it's directed with the global economy and not only in the Israeli economy. Some constraints on the Israeli economy do not affect so much Israeli innovation because, unfortunately, as I may say, Israel as or the Israeli market is not always the target of that innovation. So restrictions on activity in Israel, and we can see that in fintech. I mean, they actually, strangle innovation in the financial services system in Israel, where you have a lot of fintech Israeli companies, but they don't act in the Israeli economy and the Israeli market. First of all, it's small, and the other hand is the regulation actually kills innovation. So incumbents benefit from that. But fortunately, as I said, on the other hand, that we target the global economy, and there's a lot of opportunities, and I think that we are, as Israelis, could actually benefit from this situation. Thank you.
Just to make one 2-sentence point on Yoel's point, which I completely agree with. If I was the Israeli government, the one thing I'd be doing right now is investing money in digitizing large swaths of the Israeli economy and the interaction with government in this country. So we could use that to reduce regulation, measure the real economy, and expand the freedom and productivity of the local economy. Because it's hard to restore demand to a lot of the industries right now until kind of the corona safety gets going. But we can use this crisis to generate opportunity. And I agree with you all completely. There's a ton of opportunity coming out of this crisis, a ton. But if we kind of just let this go by without making those necessary investments locally, this will have been a terrible shame.
Okay, so our next, we have 3 more questions. We are already technically over, but we'll take 3 last questions and we'll finish. So Allah, which actually works in Apple, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
He will want to ask one more question.
Yeah, I want to ask about the government's plan to revive the market. Now, I know that printing money is usually might cause inflation or even hyperinflation, but we are in a situation that more than 20% of the people are unemployed. So printing money in this case, and we are going to have maybe a negative deflation, a negative inflation this year. So isn't printing money and causing manual inflation good step, but might be a good step by the government this time?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I mean, I think that we are not really printing money. We're increasing currently the deficit, which is not the same like printing money. So if the central bank will start, financing directly the government, this is printing money. We have a very bad experience with printing money in this country. In the 1980s, it took us a long time to get rid of this hyperinflation. We paid huge prices for that. So I hope that we won't reach this point. I think that, the US can do that because the US actually prints the world's reserve currency. So if people are willing to buy US treasuries and in the end, when things go bad, they want to buy dollars. And so that's good for the US. For a small open economy, could be really dangerous. On the other hand, the government, need to support the economy at this moment. But this is a combination. So initially you get some kind of a safety net. Not all the people that got out of work now will, be out of work in 3 or 4 months, hopefully. Still unemployment will be very high. And then you start investing in growth and inducing, and I totally agree with Michael, at the current situation, current moment, you cannot do some kind of a macro policy, fiscal policy to increase growth because, people are limited, they cannot buy. they cannot go out, they cannot participate in the economy. So it's useless. But hopefully in 2 or 3 months, when things go to the new normal, we should boost the economic activity, and the government should do that. It should do that in a better ways, like investing in infrastructure and things that actually government does normally. The government does normally, but it's a myth that the government could substitute the whole economy, right? So people are coming saying, okay, pay me compensation for all the money I lost. I mean, the government cannot compensate you for things like that. That's not logical. That's not possible. The government cannot actually substitute the whole economy. So the government could help a little bit, especially in the initial phase, and then it should do what it does best, hopefully, is investing in infrastructure, creating the right infrastructure for further growth, and going out from the way and enabling the private sector to lead. I think that one of the main issues we see, and this is very interesting, is when the government actually lends to small and medium businesses with government guarantee, is totally crowding out. So the banks stop lending. So, I mean, the bank will not lend his own money if he can lend the government's money. So in the end, you don't get the effect you wanted. You don't get the effect of extra credit into the economy. You get substitution from private capital to public capital, and this is not the outcome we want. So in that sense, I think that there is a way the government could move. Printing money as such is not a good idea.
Michael, do you want to add anything, or?
No, I have nothing to add. I think Yoel's right. I'll just say one quick macro comment, although I'm not such a macro guy. I think this notion that there's going to be inflation or anything like this, it might or might not be true. We could also turn out like Japan. There's kind of massive stagflation forever in the U.S. And in general, to the point Yoel made earlier multiple times, a large percentage of this economy, particularly the innovation economy, is focused outwards. So it a little bit matters more what happens in the global economy than happens in the Israeli economy, because so much of our demand, even for the 400,000 people in the tourism industry, a significant portion of their employment depends on the demand coming from the global economy. Same is true, obviously, of high tech and many other services.
Okay, so we have two last questions. I think one of them is directed more at Yoel, and the other is directed entirely at Michael. So the question, I'll go first for Michael. So the question is from Jonathan Schwartz. So he's asking can Michael please comment on the effect of Corona on WeWork's business model?
Candidly, I don't know. I've been not around the board table. I was an observer on the board there for years, but I haven't been around that board table in a long while at this point. So I actually don't know. Okay,
thank you. So I'll move the question that I think is directed more at Yoel, which is the question comes from Dor about the assistance of the government to the atzmaim, what's called, the self-employed. We've been hearing about that every single day on the news. Is it too much? Is it too less? And is interested in your take on it.
So, self-employed people are not eligible to unemployment benefits according to Israeli law, and it has, in normal times, it has its right merit because you decide whenever you are employed or unemployed as a self-employed, right? It's not that you've been fired from a company and then you have to look for another work. It's your decision, so you can't, rely in that sense on the government, right? You pay whenever you want to stop working. Having said that, in the current situation, that's another issue, right? So, I mean, people are losing their job, not because they've chosen to leave it or to stop working, but because there's no demand for the services. And in that sense, it is reasonable to give them some to extend the safety net to a certain extent also for them. But it differs. If you are self-employed and you have a business, So you're a business. Maybe you're not a company, but you're a business. And so, I mean, as I said before, I think the government cannot substitute the economy. So the government cannot compensate you for all the losses or all the lost revenues or whatever. It's not there. It's not feasible. But it could give you some kind of a personal safety net for a short period of time in order to create this effect, especially in cases where there's no alternative. So you are barred from going back to work and make money for yourself. But everybody wants money, and once you start giving money, everybody wants more. And there was just now, I think, so the government now is willing to give 5 billion shekels to large retail networks, chains. Okay, I mean, if the government is willing, everybody is willing to take. In the end, we have to understand that somebody will have to pay the bill, and it's all of us that will have to pay the bill in the end. So again, in the end, to pay this, we'll have to, the government will have to raise taxes, and we have to pay it back. It's not that it comes from, it's not like coming from heaven. It's very hard for everybody to see it. I'll get it now, somebody else will pay it later. But that's a huge problem. So if you don't have inflation on the way out, the only way is either the government will reduce its public services, which is not great for for all of us. It's less education, less health, less security and defense, or we have to pay more taxes in order to pay, to finance the government activities and also to pay back the loans that we've taken in this situation.
Okay, Michael, want to add something?
Yeah, I understand the Atzmaim, the independent business owners, because to Yoel's point, which I agree with, the government was giving out money anywhere without any proscription for how this should be done. So it's kind of, why not them? And the government was basically responding to the squeaky wheel syndrome, whether it was the big retailers or the Atzmaim or this, the other, it's just throwing money around. And to my mind, it highlights the core problem, which is, what are Atzmaim, these independent business owners? They are a collection of everything from hairdressers to electronics distributors to small construction companies to lots of things. And we actually don't know what they are. We have a catch-all phrase called Atzmaim, independent businesses. This is in my view, a reflection, therefore, of the government's lack of data and information or desire for on what actually underlies the economy. And the appropriate response, in my view, by the way, to all of these requests is we need data. We need to understand what we're doing on a micro level so that we're not wasting tons of dough. Because inevitably in these crises, there are fraudsters and squeaky wheels and people who really need. And we desperately need data. And I'll add one other thing. Some of these are demand problems. Some of these are challenges. Some of these are because of government intervention or whatever it is, or shutdowns. People can't open their shops. Some of them are actually, people can't go to work because their kids aren't in school and the education system's not going back. And each intervention is something different. And instead, all we do is throw money at the problem. If any one of my CEOs would come to me and say, hey, look, we've got a problem. Some of our employees can't come to work. So because their kids are at home, we need more money. I tell them to go fund, a kindergarten for the kids rather than come ask the investors for more money. But because we don't ask questions and when the government doesn't have data, we actually can't do proper interventions. And I think that is unfortunately going to be the story of this whole thing. There's nobody focused on getting data on the real underlying microeconomic problems. And we have the technology to do this. We absolutely have the technology to do this. And I don't see, why there's not a hue and outcry from everybody whose taxes are going to be raised, or for people who won't get government services because we're just kind of spilling money around so that we don't have to do hard work. And that to me is not okay.
Thank you, Michael.